Hey there, Spencer Bronte. This is part 2 of our Godzilla series, but this will be number 8 of Fact Time overall. Thanks for coming back for number 8. And we're going to continue talking about Godzilla here. I've brought back my 1954 Gojira model, and this is more or less the standard that we think of when we have the word Godzilla mentioned. This is, I believe, for most people, what you'd think of with the idea of Godzilla. But the nice thing about being a Godzilla fan right now is that we're in a golden age of Godzilla love. The Criterion Collection just released all the older 50s, 60s, and 70s movies on Blu-ray. I got that. There are toys and collectibles everywhere. I only have a few. I could not afford all of them. I wish I could. Some of them are amazing and beautiful. But there are so many great things to experience as a Godzilla fan. And there are many, many things for us, whether you're a diehard Godzilla fan like me or just casual, there are many things for us to think about and enjoy applying it to actual real life. There are things that Godzilla gives us to think about that we wouldn't be able to think about otherwise. Here in America, we've been enjoying some great success with Godzilla thanks to 2014's film Godzilla. This was a marvelous attempt at Americanizing Godzilla in a sense without many of the problems that were in the 1998 film, also called Godzilla. But the 2014 film was by Gareth Edwards. You may know him for being the director of Rogue One, the Star Wars film. Rogue One, a Star Wars story. But he directed, 2 years before that, he directed Godzilla, and I thought it was fantastic. It did a few things that I want to talk about here. It did a few things with the biology of Godzilla in the sense of functional morphology. So all that means is really what the body looks like and how it moves and how it functions. So here is a model of the 2014 Godzilla. So we can see that here, and let's compare it to the 1954 Godzilla. These are not to scale because this Godzilla is over 300 feet tall. This one's about 50... what was the number? I believe it was about 150 feet, so I think it was around 50 meters. I believe that was the scale they gave it in the film, because it wasn't actually mentioned in the film, but I believe that was the scale they were working off. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody who remembers better than I do. But anyway, if we look at this one, the original Godzilla, we see some things which would not really be expected if an animal were to be this large. Now, I do want to comment, we know that it is not possible for an animal to get this large on land. Even seagoing animals, oceanic things like the blue whale is not even nearly this big. The blue whale is as big as we have ever seen in the history of life on planet Earth, and on land, the biggest we have ever seen are the sauropod dinosaurs, the long-necked dinosaurs, with a long neck, long tail, and on 4 legs. We touched on them briefly in our first episode. Go back to Fact Time number 1 if you want to see a little bit more about those. We might get more into those later in a later episode, perhaps. But there is a limit to how big you can get just because you can't hold your body up. Your muscles can't actually move that kind of weight. There's actually a scale. The bigger your bones are, the more weight they have to hold, the thicker they have to be, and basically you'd run around with Godzilla being having enormously thick legs and only this tall and compared to this model. So it'd actually have to be much thicker, much more big boned. Its kneecaps would probably break, and its elbows and its hips wouldn't work. All sorts of things. So this is not something that is possible on planet Earth, at least. So this is a way for us to think in a fantasy or sci-fi way about what would happen, though, what does happen when we reach gigantism in life. What happens when animals are large, are gigantic? What we'd expect to see is not what we see here for a few reasons. Now, the arms are fairly large. They seem a little bit larger than what we'd expect, ratio-wise, for an animal this tall and large. The head is also pretty big. That worked because there was a man in the suit here, but there is not a man in a suit for the 2014 Godzilla. So you can see here, ratio-wise, the head is smaller and so are the arms. That makes more sense when you get gigantic. You don't need a massive head. You only need it so large to do things. You actually see that in modern animals like the giraffe. The head is not as big as you would expect it to be, scaling everything up, really. We see the same thing in the long-necked sauropod dinosaurs. So there is a limit to certain body parts, which is nice. Otherwise you'd have some crazy-looking animals. I wouldn't mind that, though. Whales have unusually large heads, so they're a little bit different. Their whole body plan is just wild. Whales are amazing. Maybe we'll get into that in one episode. But comparing these again, I'm going to talk about their feet. So let's look at their feet. You can see here, because, again, there's a human in the suit, the foot extends out, kind of like our feet. So we walk with our foot bones down, and we walk kind of like this. We have to step up. So we step up on the ball of our foot, lift the heel off the ground, and that's what we see in this sci-fi context with this original Godzilla. I would walk like this because, there was a man in the suit. And that's how we saw Godzilla in most of the movies. Now, when you're this large, though, theoretically, again, not possible, but theoretically, let's have some fun here. Don't spoil my fun. If you're this large, imagine the amount of weight you have in your body. So therefore, imagine the amount of force on your poor little foot bones. They would probably break. So this structure does not make too much sense. This is something we see in nature even now with much smaller animals. Things like elephants. You ever look at their feet? They don't have feet just like us sticking out and then they walk on the balls of their feet and lift their heel off. They have their toes directed downwards and they walk on pillar-like legs. Same thing in the rhinoceros. Same thing in the hippopotamus. You see the same thing in the long-necked sauropod dinosaurs. Their back feet had basically circular structure, basically, with the toes kind of wrapped around in this sort of a sense, and they left these roundish trackways. Those are their back legs. Their front legs did something different but similar. They were half-mooned, kind of, so their toes are directed like this, so their trackways leave these little half-circle, like moon shapes on their front legs. So they're still walking with their toes downward. They're not doing that torque, that lifting kind of physical maneuver that we do when we walk, because we're not that heavy. So we would think if Godzilla were real, Godzilla would not be doing that sort of thing with its foot, which you actually see wonderfully reflected here in the 2014 Godzilla. Its toes only stick out just a little bit. The toe claws are the largest portion of what sticks out there. Let's put my hand there so you can kind of see that. And we actually see a close-up of its foot. It's the big close-up when the animal, Godzilla itself, reaches the Hawaii airport, and you see the foot slam down. You see some foot motion in other parts of the film. There's no really torquing or any angular movement there. It's just stomp, 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 and that is what we'd expect if Godzilla were a real animal. Now, largely, we believe, for nostalgia's sake, in the sequel to the 2014 Godzilla, last year's film Godzilla King of the Monsters, taking that old title, like we mentioned in our previous part on Godzilla, part 1. Taking that old title, they had the wonderful 2019 film, and they updated Godzilla, again, I think probably for some nostalgia, so they made longer toes, the arms are bigger, the head's a little bit bigger, and they changed the spine to that scalloped kind of original form instead of these spiky things in the 2014 form. So you can kind of see here that difference here. Bigger arms, a little bit bigger head, not too much there, but the feet are different. This foot is more in the sense of, this foot, head, and arms a little bit more in the sense of what you would not expect to see if Godzilla were real. There's also one more thing, the tail. It's reasonable to see a very, very thin tail. I'm going to use my face for a backlight here. This very, very thin tail on the 2014 Godzilla. Very, very thin, which makes sense. If you're that large, you can get down very small. It just, doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but I think it makes some sense. And then on this one, you see this tail is a bit thicker on the 2019 Godzilla. They kind of patch it into the story in a sense of why the same animals very, very different from one movie to the next. They don't actually talk about it in the movie so much. They do discuss it lightly in the comic, which shows the two films together. Godzilla actually has its spine shattered in a battle with another monster, and we assume it must have grown back. And as my own personal fan theory, I'm assuming that in that process, or at least in some process, Godzilla also grew bigger on other parts and had their toes grow out and their foot grow more, their head and their arms and their tail grow out a little bit differently. So that's just some brief stuff. Well, over 10 minutes. Not quite that brief. Some stuff on Godzilla. We have more to talk about with Godzilla, though. So we are going to continue our series. So strap in again. We got more Godzilla coming. Thank you very much for watching. Come back for next episode.